Welcome to another episode of You Should Read It. You Should Read This. I'm here, as always, with Tom van der Lubbe. And this week, Tom's got it held up for those watching. We will be reviewing The Man Who Broke Capitalism, how Jack Welch gutted the heartland and crushed the soul of corporate America, and how to undo his legacy, by David Gellis. I presume that's how you pronounce his name. And again, another pick from you, Tom. So I wonder if, once again, it should be you to introduce this book.
Yeah, I chose the book because I think our generation, and I'm talking about those who, let's say, started to be educated from the 80s on. We all are raised with Jack Welch and GE, and I would just take the introduction of the book as a more intellectual introduction, but it reflects why I thought it's interesting to discuss the book. And it starts with the following sentence: to understand the civilization, consider its heroes. Our heroes reflect our collective aspirations. And then he says, ancient Egyptians glorified the pharaohs, etc., the Greeks, the philosophers, etc., etc. But let's say in our shareholder value capitalism, which I would define especially from the 80s on, or with the starting, and we'll come to that, of the article of Milton Friedman, I think our god was Jack Welch. And what's interesting now that we're moving to another phase of capitalism, I think, or at least reflect a lot on that. It's interesting that American journalist, because that he is, I think he is from the New York Times. I was a little bit waiting for it, so that there would be a kind of reflection on what happened. And I think it's an interesting book to review.
Yes, I agree. And I was somebody who read Jack Welch's book from the gut and took a lot. I mean, I'd like to think I was skeptical of some of it at the time, and I can't truly recall my reaction, but I do remember reading it avidly at the time that it came out. So yes, it did have an impact on me, and it's so interesting to see. And we'll get into how he defines Welchism and what it means, but in the way that he lays it out, it is still so prevalent. It's so prevalent in the corporate world. And of course, you and I are very familiar with the examples that run against this trend. And he himself cites, the author here cites some examples in the last chapter of the book. But yeah, we're still in the grip of Welchism. You could put it that way, I would say. Okay, so I think you very often do a good job at just laying out, the structure of the book and the various sections. Would you like to break down that, like the main flow?
Yeah, I think it's. We also should say something more about the introduction, because I think we should have a short stop at Milton Friedman, and then it's more. The book is built in a chronological way. So it starts with then the development of GE, then also the context of electronics and car industry, etc. And then it becomes stronger and I would call it more crazy, or much more into, let's say, kind of maximizing those goals, and then it ends more or less with the negative externalities, and then the last chapter is about beyond Welchism. But I think, let's say, the first 1 to 6 pages is all the time. It's a kind of maximalization of what's happening, and then 7 and 8 is a kind of reflection, and then how do we turn the ship in the other direction?
Yeah, that's right. And one thing I hadn't quite appreciated until I read this book, was just how awful of a character he was, right? The bawling out of executives, how every meeting would end with a shouting match. The fact that on the campus he created to train new executives, he heard the story of some of the participants watching a lesbian porn movie, at that campus, which forced a couple of the women in the room to walk out, and how he just laughed that out. And so those points about his, let's say, his morality really, really struck me. And I think that's a theme that's is touched on during the book, but perhaps I found a little underplayed to some extent. That this is a story of morality, I think, in Jack Welch, in corporate America, in society at large, or perhaps the lack of or lack thereof. But yeah, that was something that immediately struck me in the story when we were in the early part of the book when we were charting his rise to the top of GE.
Yeah, although what I also see is, but perhaps we just dive into those chapters. What you also see is how fast society also changes. So if you just take other examples of, let's say, I mean, I don't want to put all the topics like slavery and feminism, etc. I won't put them all on the table. But if you just see how fast in one generation conversations change at dinner tables, etc., or let's say fraternities, etc., etc., there is a lot going on, or lesbian, gay movement, etc. Which, let's say, I mean, I'm Dutch, so that was not a great topic anymore when I was raised in the Netherlands. But still, if you just see in one generation how this acceptance of, for instance, homosexuals are able to marry, etc., has changed in 25 years' time, and you also see this in all parts of society. And discussions in boardrooms 25 years ago were just very male, masculine discussions. Probably, I mean, I was not at that time in the boardroom, but if you just read and see those pictures, etc., you can just imagine what kind of jokes were made after dinner, smoking the cigar, so to say. So, but let's say from if you just see and if you read between the lines, it's a kind of toxic situation. But I would like to start because I just reflected on Milton Friedman, because I don't know if everybody is familiar with this. I think what is very strong in the introduction is that he starts with the article in 1970 of Milton Friedman, where the, let's say, theoretical layer was laid down as kind of fundament of what happens after that, where this very famous article was about saying companies are only there to maximize profits for their shareholders. So that is the theoretical starting point of shareholder value capitalism, and then it takes 10 years when Reagan comes to power, or Thatcher, etc. And let's say Jack Welch and those other people, they are a product also of their time and those developments. If Jack Welch would have been there, then somebody else. And there are numerous of these kind of people who just said, okay, see, Friedman got a Nobel Prize. I mean, it's now from hindsight, you say, oh, that's interesting. But and also, if you dive into Friedman is also much more, let's say, nuanced. He just says, okay, the state should rule and take the responsibility for let's say, societal goals. He doesn't say that those goals are not important, but you could also frame it in another way and say, okay, Friedman just says you can't leave these topics to companies because they just have another goal. You can also frame it like that. At the moment, we frame it and say Milton Friedman only wanted companies to earn as much as possible, but that's also not the case if you just read his articles. But that's the starting point in the introduction, and I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, that's right. And the other thread running through this is the financialization, which is running parallel. the financialization of economies, the advent of new communications technologies, and the ability to transfer money around the world, the liberalization of, to some degree, the banking and financing. Although interestingly, all through this period that he's coming to prominence, there's still, certainly during the 80s, there's still a relatively high level of financial regulation, which of course becomes liberalized even more later on. But I think those twin factors of an embrace of shareholder capitalism within a much more financialized economy were the preconditions, I suppose, for this style of capitalism.
Yeah, this, if you would, let's say, from hindsight, or take it from a historical perspective, you could say, okay, it starts with 1970, Milton Friedman, and then, or 1980, Reagan and Thatcher, and then at this moment we would say perhaps financial crisis 2008, 2009, but that's not really clear. And then afterwards, it starts to be unclear where is there a kind of new fundament where we get back to multi-stakeholder capitalism. So that's let's say the way framing this. And then GE is the biggest and most extreme example to show this.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think there's also, and this is I suppose a hypothesis of mine, and he doesn't really talk about it in the book, but something about, for me, there's a spiritual factor here, or a morality factor. Is this also coinciding at some level with as a decline in morality in society, right? And there seemed to me underpinning this a sort of spiritual malaise that because you could look at all of these things in terms of greed, wrath, lust, that seem to get enabled and tolerated, throughout.
It's also a moral crisis. You could also call it time of egoism, or greed is good. You can also see those at Tom Wolfe, etc., Bonfire of Vanities, etc. So this time has its economic system. It has its art, its movies, its music, etc. It has its own. It's not only economics, like you have the 60s with the music and the protests, etc., and a different way of fashion, etc., etc. So but if you dive to it now from a business perspective, then GE is the Tom Wolfe of this economic play which is going on.
Yeah, and an inversion of I suppose classic morality, right? It's the greed is good.
Yeah. So, do you want to dive into the next chapter, or?
Yeah, please. Well, go for it.
You or am I?
No, you go for it.
I go for it. Okay. Now they start to explain this whole starting point, and there I just also want to make a remark. It starts that he takes over, and then starts to lay off people. But I think it would have been wiser also for the acceptance of the book to create a little bit more context, because if you just see what happened in the world at that time, all those, it's a start of the globalization, so to say. And it started with Japan, and everybody thought at that time, okay, Japan will rule the world, and we will just lose, because from a productional point of view, Japanese are much better. And it was everywhere around the world. It was the car industry. Porsche was nearly bankrupt. They went to Japan to see how Toyota did Kaizen, which is later then mentioned also in the book in Six Sigma. Consumer electronics were just, everybody was thinking, okay, we're not going to survive this. Philips had the same stuff, the same problem, Siemens, etc. And they were talking about Japan, and they said, okay, the next country which will take over is South Korea. And at that moment, there were three options: close down the whole stuff and just say, okay, sorry, we lost, or downsizing, which Jack Welch did and others did, or starting to build their own factories in Asia and transporting your factory equipment. The same happened with textiles, etc. Bring it to India or in northern Africa, etc. So I think to give him some, I wouldn't say perhaps even I would say credits, because I think it even would have been better in the book first to accept those possibilities they had, to explain it much more with globalization. There's somewhere in the book they're showing the labor cost in Japan or China in comparison to the US, and that's a factor 100 or something like that. To understand what was going on at that time, because if you didn't live at that time, you just say, yeah, why are you closing the factories down? Because they were loss making. And he also doesn't quantify the losses which were made. So as I repeat, Philips had the same problem, making television screens, etc. And then Sony was the big company at that time with the Walkman, etc. And they said, okay, Sony will take over, and Sony was doing very, very well. So that's the start. And then the question was, yeah, how do you organize this in a way? How do you change such a company where 400,000 people work or something like this? And that is described then. And then there's this rule of taking out 10% every year, which is a very simple rule, because you just tell to everybody, to every manager, every year you have to take out the worst 10% of your workforce, to just cut labor costs in a let's say in a substantial way. And I actually was amazed that when he started to lay off people, that in the beginning were only 7% or something like that. I just remembered and thought, okay, that was done in a much more extreme way, like you see nowadays. But at that time, that was perhaps extreme. But if you just see the way, let's say, tech companies lay off people at the moment, that has become, I wouldn't say that's correct, but has become much more normal than at that time.
Yeah,
that's the starting chapter, I would say.
Yeah, and I hadn't appreciated that context, that these factories were as loss making as they were, and he doesn't mention the competition from Japan and the fact they were suffering. It's more presented as he's wantonly cutting jobs as a means to increase profits.
It's on page 42. So it says by the end of 82, the company had shed 35,000 employees, almost 9% of the workforce, and they had 411,000 people in 1980. So this is an enormous amount of people. And then he is called Neutron Jack. That's in this chapter 2. And then he starts, and it also said, he doesn't say exactly how much losses they made, but it says somewhere that they were loss making.
Okay, I hadn't appreciated that.
I see it, but it also would make, for instance, sense from an economic point of view to mention those numbers, just to see, okay, if he wouldn't have acted, and it was the same at Siemens and the same at Philips and all those companies who also produce those white goods, etc. Electrolux, you can mention them all. They all had the same problems. Bosch, they all had the same problems. And because all these TV sets and house appliances, they all came from Japan.
Right.
Radios, everything, and it went so fast. And cars, and at the beginning, everybody said, no, the Japanese, they can't build cars. They're so ugly and etc. But they progressed enormously, and they were just superior on the production side. And then at a certain point, you had cars, and they were not only cheap. No, they also were pretty well produced. And then
Oh yeah.
and then all those car makers, they lost their sales. And who did survive? On the one spectrum, the German car makers, because they were in this expensive high segment. And then the rest was taken over more or less by the Japanese. That was the situation at the beginning of the 80s. Chrysler also. I mean, that's another. I don't know if it's just in the next chapter. They all had enormous problems, and everybody was thinking, "Oh, how will we survive in the West? Will Japan take over the economic world?" That was the perception at that time.
Yeah, and it's interesting how this links back to Friedman, because of course the politicians weren't responding to this and putting out protectionist policies and railing against free trade and closing the borders to Japanese cars. They were saying to the business sectors, suck it up. This is free trade. You need to compete. So they weren't being protected by politicians.
And you had, for instance, strikes. I remember in the UK where Thatcher. There were strikes in the media sector where they still were setting the newspapers by hand with the stuff, etc. And they want to automate it, and it was not possible because the labor unions blocked. Or you also had, let's say, the coal mines, where you couldn't lay off people, although let's say people got sick, and it was enormous expensive. Because they had to go, I don't know how many 100 meters under the ground in Germany and the Netherlands, and everybody was opposing it. Textile industry exactly the same. So it was and I mean, if you didn't live at that time, it's not imaginable. So at the moment we have this kind of crisis, much more about sustainability and climate, etc. At that time, we were just thinking, okay, will the West survive from an economic point of view? Because it was the starting point of the globalization. Yeah, and I think it would have been fair to create a kind of more context, because if people didn't live at that time, they don't have this context, and I would say, what were they doing? Why were just laying off people?
Right.
But it is said to be, let's say, 52. It says GE Consumer Electronics it faced growing competition from Japanese and Korean manufacturers, were turning out superior products for a fraction of the cost. So it is said, but it would have made sense to put some more numbers on that. And it says Welch and his management team convinced workers to accept concessions. And now the final part comes: pay cuts that might help the division turn a profit. So they were loss making, and they were heavy. All those companies were heavy loss making. So that's the starting point. And then he is able to buy this massive layoffs to manage the turnaround. And he was not the only one. So those examples are also mentioned. IBM had the same problem with the big mainframe computers.
Yeah.
Where Lou Gessner did a turnaround, and is also mentioned as one of the big managers at that time. And Lee Iacocca with Chrysler had the same problem with the Japanese car industry. So, I mean, they are also mentioned in the book, but very briefly. But those huge companies with enormous workforces had exactly the
who were treated very well, right?
And they had exactly the same problem. And so IBM also had a number, but let's say that's the positive starting point, and then perhaps you should move to where it becomes more problematic, I would say.
Yes, well, and I suppose in that context, you can understand why perhaps there were people around Welch who if they were thinking, one of the ways out of this mess is through cuts. We want someone like Welch, right, who is pugnacious, who is ruthless, who doesn't have that. Well, I suppose has a different set of ethics. And you can understand why he rises to prominence in that context.
Yeah, and what also happens to someone on a personal field if somebody becomes more and more successful, huh?
Yeah.
So this whole idea of self-reflection just disappears, so to say.
Yes. And then we start to see as the story progresses is that I suppose a couple of things happen, right? I mean, he is awarded more and more stock of the company, so he is incentivized around stock price. His reward is primarily around the performance of the stock, and then he eyes this opportunity in GE Finance to make profits much more easily. There isn't the need for R&D. There isn't long cycles of innovation. He can use GE's credit rating, very high credit rating, to go out and make acquisitions and finance property deals. And so this is a major part of the story of his rise, is this growth, the growth of GE Finance, and how he uses that. And then a third plank to that is that it's also much easier to manipulate the books with this finance arm than it is in other areas of business, which allows him to engage in this smoothing out of earnings, which of course stock analysts love, and so that gives him another means to manipulate the share price performance.
Yeah, that's a financialization of the economy, huh? Which, although I just wanted to, because I found it, the numbers I was searching for on page 80. It says something about the difference in cost of labor. So it was this is another example, but it says $14 an hour in comparison to 30 cents in China. So so it's also a book about the effects of globalization.
Yeah.
And it says he had machinery from the headquarters in New Britain disassembled, sent across the world, and reassembled for cheaper labor force. And that was happening all over. And it also happened to the car industry afterwards. But it also happens at the moment. How many IT people work for Microsoft in India?
Right. Yeah. Or brought over from India to work.
That's nothing new. And the other thing, I was searching for the numbers just also to frame it in comparison to Jack Welch layoffs. It's on page 70. I found the number. IBM, Lou Gessner. Within months of Gessner's arrival at IBM, the unthinkable happened. 60,000 of Big Blue's employees were let go. It was the largest mass layoff in history at that time. So Jack Welch laid off 9,000, and then 10 years later, Gessner 60,000. And then on page 71, Leah Coca, which is those three guys were those super CEOs at that time. Chrysler in the 80s and 90s closed factories. Decided to fire 40,000 people. So and then let's say if there wouldn't have been a combination with enormous own salaries, then you could say, okay, somebody would have acted in favor of the company to survive. But what it makes a little bit difficult is then if you just see that this enormous incentive programs in combination with shareholder-driven stock price optimization then takes over also and stays also there when things go much better, and that's the whole part of GE Capital you just mentioned.
Yeah, the GE Capital, and yeah, that's a really important point, isn't it? if you're going to be rewarded as a CEO through stock price, and you're going to be rewarded in the short term, right? You don't tend to get rewarded for long-term performance of stocks. It's the short-term performance of stocks, and you've got a massive workforce, and you've got strong competition overseas. What's the quickest and easiest way to keep your board happy, right? It's to engage in financial manipulation and to get into finance, and so it does make sense from that perspective. And of course, we do now have modern examples of companies who do compete with companies with much lower labor rights. I'm thinking of Viisi in France, the machine components operators who have radically changed their culture. And actually done a lot of what Jack Welch might approve of, which is, completely eliminate middle management and bureaucracy. But if you're in the position of that CEO and your choices are engage in financial manipulation and develop your GE Capital, your finance business, versus a wholesale radical transformation of your business culture, you're probably going to go for the former. You're going to go for the easier option.
Yeah, what I found a very good quote. It's on page 106, and I also find it a good quote because it's a board member of Goldman Sachs, he's quoted. He says, "A lot of GE leaders were thought to be business geniuses," said Bill George, the former CEO of Medtronic and a board member of Goldman Sachs. "But they were just cost cutters, and you can't cost cutting your way to prosperity." And I think that's a very good way of putting this, and it happens over and over again. If you do a turnaround in a company and you bring a company from loss making to profitability, then it has an enormous effect on your price, on your stock price, which everybody understands, because there's a big difference between going bankrupt and earning money, and that has an enormous effect on the stock price. But when you have finally, let's say, done the turnaround, and when you grow, and it's the same for a growth path, if you're stock listed and you grow, then at a certain point, the valuation has just accepted your way of growing. And then at a certain point, you're not able to grow as fast as you did in the past. And then the question is, what do you do? Do you accept? Because you have the share price is a discounted cash flow model. When your cash flows go down and your stock price goes down, and you're incentivized, or your incentive is your stock price in your own salary, how are you going to solve this? Are you just accept that you not have a bonus, or are you accepting that your stock options don't have the value anymore like they had in the past? And then it becomes tricky. And I think that's the turning point in the book, where you see that earning a lot of money and raising the stock price over and over, and more or less saying we're always meeting those goals of the market, there it becomes nasty. And I think the most central example in the book is, and it's also a very well-known example, is the Boeing example.
Right.
So perhaps you want to say something about the Boeing example, if you know what I.
Yes. So this is the Boeing 737 MAX, which was Boeing's new. Let's wind back a little bit even further from that, right? So Boeing has a choice. It realizes it's experiencing competition from Airbus in Europe, and it has a choice as to whether to develop a whole new plane or to take the 737 and effectively upgrade it. Knowing that the choice to develop a new plane from scratch, of course, is going to have an impact on short-term earnings, and will only pay off in the long term. And so Boeing makes the choice to develop the 737 MAX. And one of the things they discover in the development of this, that there's a problem with its its elevation and the way that its nose cone operates and in flight conditions. So it creates this sensor on the nose cone that detects when they're suffering from this elevation problem, or the aircraft is suffering from the elevation problem. But instead of being upfront with the market and its customers about this flaw of the design and this need for the sensor, they don't, and so they create this single point of failure in that if this sensor doesn't operate effectively, it's extremely dangerous for the aircraft. But they go to market with it anyway. They don't tell their customers about it, and ultimately there's a crash. Lion Airlines in Ethiopia is on a flight to Malaysia, and the plane crashes, people die, and Boeing never really comes clean. They never come clean about the issue. The CEO intimates that this is a problem with the pilots, and not a fault of the aircraft, but a very real example of how this cost-cutting short-termism affects the quality of the product, and the culture in Boeing was very similar to the culture in GE.
But there's a second crash. Huh?
Right.
There are two crashes after another. So and that's even, let's say, a maximalization of this absurd situation. That's okay. Something goes wrong. Plane crashes. All those passengers die. Then everybody knows that you have a severe problem, but because they want to keep the share price on a certain level, they said no, it's everything under control, etc. Although let's say if you just see then documents released later to the Congress, it's page 156, and then I mean it's also not. I mean the way the book is written, it's a journalist, so it's not a scientific book. So I mean it's normal that you search for juicy quotes. It says here the airplane is designed by clowns who are in turn supervised by monkeys. Read one message. This is a joke. Read another. The airplane is ridiculous. Another wrote. I honestly don't trust many people at Boeing. So and then I mean you have this discussion in Congress, but it's just a very extreme example of that. Not before something happens, but after something happens and people die. Not even then, people are cleaning up the mess and saying, "Okay, we have to admit that we made mistakes. Now we need another mistake of the same caliber before something happens."
Yeah. I mean, it's shocking, and of course, in the airline industry, the stakes are much higher. I mean, it's one thing to cut corners and decrease the quality on washing machines or toasters. I guess there is risks there, but it's entirely another to do that with airplanes.
Yeah, you have perhaps, let's say, the example, and we won't dive into this, but you have all those scandals of accounting, Enron, etc. It all comes from that situation, finalization of your whole companies. That what Jack Welch, who by education was he studied chemistry, but he just saw, okay, why should I have these enormous difficulties in producing, etc., when I can earn so much money in a much easier way by building leasing companies, etc., and which he did with GE Capital. And if you just see the numbers of stuff they financed all around the world and how much money they earned with a, let's say, still substantial amount of people, but enormously. And that's what we also see in other books, that if you just see how much money Goldman Sachs or others in the financial industry make in comparison with, let's say, producing stuff, if it's toasters or radios, etc. It's the same with the whole IT and software companies, like Apple and Microsoft, etc. If you just see what margins they have for their software, it's not comparable with producing something.
Right. And the other point being made in the book is that there was a period where people working in the financial sector in banking world didn't earn substantially more than those working in other sectors. It was relatively comparable, but that has changed radically. And I'm an example. I mean, I trained at university in electronic engineering. And where did I get a job? Not in an engineering firm. I went to get a job with Arthur Andersen. I got a job as a management consultant, serving, these captains of industry. I mean, even that term is loaded. Who in many cases their principal aim was the financialization of their firms. So I've to some extent been complicit in this shift. It's and I can remember. I mean, and the difference is extraordinary. I mean, the difference in starting salary for an engineer and a management consultant, let alone an investment banker, which would have been another step again. Was stuck.
And for me, it's exactly the same, man. I mean, I was educated to become a diplomat, and then I started at McKinsey, exactly the same. And the starting salary was just crazy in comparison to all the other stuff you could do.
Yeah.
And then you had the brightest students who studied medicine whatsoever, or concert pianists, and doesn't matter, theoretical physicists, etc. It doesn't matter what it was. They just took all the brightest from any discipline, because their salaries, Goldman Sachs, exactly the same. So that's but I think that's the first part is just it becomes more and more extreme, and then probably this example of Boeing is just also, let's say, from a kind of visualization, because an airplane which goes down is different than Enron. So I think it shows in a very good way that even an airplane which comes down and hundreds of people who die didn't stop the craziness. And then the question is, beyond this, what kind of effects does this have? Because there at the moment are a few books written on this, and I would like to frame this as kind of polarization, inequality, taking out the middle man or the middle management, etc. The normal jobs. It's you have to, on the one hand, you have the very low paid jobs in the warehouses of Amazon and taxi drivers for Uber. And on the other hand, you have the bright guys. If you see the average salary of Google, it's, I think, 300,000 or something like that. It's incredible. So this kind of polarization, and I think the book does this very well by let's say writing an chapter which is called the negative externalities. It's chapter 7, which I find interesting to zoom out and to say, okay, what kind of effect does this focus on finalization and shareholder value has, or what does it have for effects on our society as a whole? And I don't know if you want to say something.
No. Tell me more about your takeaway here. And
because you have a lot. On the one hand, you have this kind of inequality. Then you have the job insecurity, and then you see, for instance, page 171. This whole idea of bonus culture, which nowadays younger people just think bonuses are normal. I mean, we did a whole podcast interview on this salary models. That let's say this idea of individual exceptional people, which let's say by these bonuses creates a totally different atmosphere. So it creates a work atmosphere of against each other in comparison to working with each other. And then he is also mentioning Steve Ballmer, who was a friend of Immelt, the successor of Jack Welch at GE. And so this whole way of this kind of management culture and the way people were raised, those people are in a lot of those companies just implementing the same kind of tools. It's a kind of survival of the fittest Darwinistic principle. And it's interesting how he describes this.
It reminds me of a metaphor one of my podcast guests used of it. It's like the way that we treat workers now. It's like it's like they're all cats, and we put a little bit of cat food just in front of them, right? To gobble up, and that the whole thing is sort of incentivizing the individual to get from them exactly the behaviors we want to optimize our business model. Yeah, and of course it's all in the language. I know this is sort of overdone almost to this point now, but the human resources, right? We're the broader atomization of society.
What I saw perhaps, and I was just curious. I mean, he is describing Amazon. Cameras and computers are watching Amazon employees every minute of the day. And you have also a lot of books written on this whole Orwellian way of all those cameras around and this control and the negative side of this whole transparency. And he writes at page 173 about Amazon, and I was not able to check it, but I just couldn't believe it. The company loses about 3% of its hourly workforce every week, translating into a turnover rate of some 150% a year. And I was just thinking how it is possible. But let's say this is the contrast of long life employment of those companies like IBM and GE, where the book is starting with. So that's the end of the book. This idea that you can't be secure of your job. In the past, you had perhaps too much security because you couldn't do anything you want, and as long as you didn't steal, there was no problem. But now it's the other way. It's the other opposite extreme, that you don't have any security and you're waiting as a driver for Uber or Amazon, etc. If you're allowed to work today, or you have this 0-hour contracts, and then you have a kind of algorithm, and they tell you, okay, you work for H&M, or it's called H&M, or this fashion companies, and then you know in the morning if you have to go to your work or not, because I don't know, a combination of weather and other data gives you a sign if you are needed as a workforce, so to say. I mean, and it's kind of that's not a human way of.
Well, it's back to the morality tale. I mean, so much of this is a morality tale. I mean, what is the ethical framework of the manager who signs up on that kind of a system? Or when it's never just an individual, which I guess is one of the flaws of this book, is that it focuses so much on an individual. But I understand why he wants to tell the story in this way, to take down a hero. But it's this broader question of where's virtue gone? Where's the honor of virtue in the workplace setting?
Yeah, I was just waiting because for the quote of Carnegie, that you can that you can't die rich or something. I don't know exactly the quote, but because he makes a comparison with the Gilded Age, and then he takes Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg, three men who founded technology companies, possessed as much wealth as the entire bottom half of the United States combined. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And I'm just reading another book where there is a philosophical question: could there also be a kind of cap on wealth? I mean, we can also decide in a lot of countries there's a kind of minimum wage. Could there also be a maximum wage? But even asking this question is a kind of, you're putting in a kind of anarchist, Marxist role if you would dare to ask this question. But let's say the more our society falls apart, the more you will see books on this kind of topics.
I think that's right. I think it's inevitable. I mean, look at the rise of Bernie Sanders in the States. I mean, that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. But the fact he got as far as he did and he was as popular as he was suggests that there are many people clamoring for that kind of response, right? A more authoritarian response to this situation. I think that's inevitable.
That's the last chapter, which says beyond Welchism, a more responsible business model. And what I find interesting is, before diving into the person he uses here, it's in the end the old model, the old multi-stakeholder model. So I mean, he takes Paul Polman of Unilever, a Dutchman, although he doesn't explain that Unilever is half English, half Dutch. Okay, that's not a topic. But let's say in the end, if you want to survive, it doesn't matter as an individual or as a company or as a state, etc. You also have to take interest of other players into account. If you are just egoistic, it will end badly. It doesn't matter. And just one of those human principles. And then that's the topic you just also mentioned. It's in the end, it's about morality. It's we live in a moral crisis, and all those other crises are derived from that.
I think that's right, and I think I think he's right. And he pulls out some fantastic examples of PayPal, for example, at the end of this, which I hadn't realized he developed this index of the net disposable income, and it's now calculating that for each of its employees, i.e., how much money have you got left after you've paid your taxes and your basic bills. And if and I think they're aiming for that to be at least 20-30%, having found that many people were struggling even to get through the month. So you do see these point examples of companies, and of course, Viisi, the company that you're a leader of, is one, and there are many others taking on this virtue-oriented approach to business. I mean, what's interesting is he doesn't really talk. He talks about it very much through sort of company culture lens at the end. He doesn't wind out to society at large. He doesn't really take on how might we definancialize society. He doesn't take on how might we need to deglobalize. I mean, he cites Klaus Schwab and the WF as a potential source of inspiration for stakeholder capitalism, seeming to ignore the fact that Klaus Schwab is one of the principal components of globalism, which got us into this place in the first place, or was a contributing factor to where we're at. It feels a bit undercooked, his last chapter.
I totally agree. What I also find interesting is, and I take I take an example again on page 215, and then it's about let's say paying living wages, offer better pay and benefits. And he says we need to move beyond the world where employees of profitable multinational corporations qualify for food stamps, which to my point of view is insane. I mean, it doesn't exist to my point of view in continental Europe. But then he continues, and that can only happen when employers commit to offering their workers a living wage. No, it's just when, as a society, in politics, we decide what a minimum wage is, and that the minimum wage can't be a wage or a salary, where you still need food stamps. So, and that should be the answer to that. So I was just amazed that on the one hand, he is so extremely critical about let's say the starting point of that's why I just talked and dived into this turnaround. And on the other hand, it's so simple. If you would just take the Scandinavian countries, or it doesn't matter, perhaps Europe as a whole. In most countries, you just have a normal understanding that the minimum wage is the wage where you can pay all the stuff you need. If you, let's say, work between 35 and 40 hours a week, where the state supplies whatever you want, public transport, schools in a way, hospitals. It may be different from country to country, but there is a common understanding about basic fundament in society, and that means that the society as a whole, by their politicians, decides the rules of the game, and they are not left over to the companies, because problem is it's not you can't solve this if you own a company, because if you would pay higher salaries, this PayPal example, and somebody else doesn't, then it's not a level playing field. So I would say he just lost. He took the wrong road there, which I found interesting. And then,
well, yeah, I mean, I would frame it as it's a partial answer, right? Of course, business leaders have a part to play in this, but there are many layers here, and we need action and a shift on all layers.
Much easier if you just raise the minimum salary and say, okay, we have to do a new statistical research. Where is this at the moment? And you just have to raise it. And there's another one.
But even that by itself, if you've not got protectionist policies, then you're still exposing the companies to global competition. So it's got to be all of a piece, hasn't it?
Yeah, but in a lot of the interesting thing is that especially where you're exposed to global, let's say severe global competition, often the percentage of labor cost of your whole cost has changed since a few decades now. So it depends very much also on the sector. So if you produce something in a kind of fully automated factory where you have a few percent of labor cost, it's not important if the guy who stands beside the machine what he earns. So but at least, I mean, I would say it is a discussion in society which has to be solved in a kind of political debate. That's where the stuff is solved.
Yeah, I think a political and ethical and cultural, right?
And then you're back to your point. It's a moral discussion.
Yeah.
Do we, as a society, accept that if people work 40 hours, that they're still not able to just to finance their lives, that they have a decent, normal life? That's the moral question.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, let's end it on that. Because I've really enjoyed this conversation. Once again, we were reviewing The Man Who Broke Capitalism, how Jack Welch gutted the heart, lung, and crushed the soul of corporate America, and how to undo his legacy. So thank you so much, Tom. We'll be back for another fantastic book. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you, Richard.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Should Read This with me, Richard Atherton, and my fantastic co-host, Tom van der Lubbe. If any of the material in this show resonated with you, if you're thinking, perhaps, how could I take these ideas and apply them in my own leadership or take them forward into my own organization, then I would love to have a conversation with you about that. If that feels like that could be a valuable use of your time, then please do click on the Calendly link in the description for this episode, and that will allow you to book a slot directly into my calendar. And I hope to speak to you soon.